He has served as the spiritual leader of Congregation Beth Shalom since July of 2014. A native of Toronto, Canada, Rabbi Glazer holds a BA in French language and literature and a master's in Jewish philosophy and a PhD in Hebrew hermeneutics. Rabbi Glazer is also the author of Mystical Vertigo, Kabbalistic Hebrew Poetry Dancing Across the Divide, a new
physiognomy.
Thank you, of Jewish thinking, critical theory after Adorno as applied to Jewish thought, and contemporary Hebrew mystical poetry, how it redeems Jewish thinking. He also, doesn't say here, has a background in film, which makes him all the better to be talking about this today. So please give a welcome to Rabbi Glazer.
Well, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for that generous introduction, Gravity. I want to, first of all, thank you for all of your diligent work in doing these talks and everything you do in terms of the curation side of things, along with my thanks to Lori for this opportunity to share in some work that really is close to my heart. I was waxing very nostalgic as I was beginning to go through some of the lenses and also through all of the amazing material that takes weeks to go through in this exhibit. So it's incredibly rich and it's really wonderful to be here. The talk that I'm going to give today, I've titled, it's evolved since it was printed. So the working title now is The Kabbalah of Kubrick, Creativity from the Other Side. And it's fitting that that Lori and I had a chance to actually meet on a Bay Area mission to Israel, and we started talking about some of the loves that we share in common, aside from art. And she eventually figured out and heard that I was a filmmaker in my past incarnation, and then Gravity went to work and discovered that I've spent a lot of time actually doing film. But one of the things that I just want to say as well is I think it's incredibly important, the work that the CJM does in terms of offering its space and moments like these to be kind of a laboratory for conversations that don't happen anywhere else. I think that's incredibly important in terms of San Francisco, in terms of arts and culture, but also in terms of Jewish life. So I'm really grateful that this exists here. And for some strange reason, I have this sneaking suspicion that Kubrick, Zichron Livracha, would probably be smiling that a rabbi is doing the final talk on his films. So we'll keep that in mind. Now, to unpack this strange title that I'm offering, The Kabbalah of Kubrick, Creativity from the Other Side, I want to contextualize Kubrick in a different way than he's been contextualized so far. And I want to look at him as a mystic. And I would like to look at him as a mystic in relationship to two other mystics that, from my perspective, are really important in helping to appreciate what it is that Kubrick is doing in terms of his own brand of mysticism. I want to look at, for a moment, Samuel Beckett, a micro moment at Leonard Cohen, and then to go into to Kubrick to expand on the theme. So I want to start with the story, which you may have heard before. It's a story of an Englishman who needed a pair of striped trousers in a hurry for the New Year festivities. He goes to a tailor to take measurements. That's the lot. The tailor says to him, "Come back in 4 days. I'll have it ready." Good. What happens 4 days later? "Sorry, so sorry. Come back in a week. I've made a mess of the seat." Good. That's all right. A neat seat can be very ticklish. A week later, "Frightfully sorry. Come back in 10 days. I've made a hash of the crotch." Good. Can't be helped. A snug crotch is always a teaser. 10 days later, the story goes on. "Dreadfully sorry," the tailor says. "Come back in a fortnight. I've made a balls of the fly." Good at a pinch. A smart fly is a stiff proposition. Well, to make it short, the bluebells are blowing and he bullocks the buttonholes. And so the customer comes back to him and says, "God damn you to hell, sir. No, it's indecent. There are limits. In 6 days, do you hear me? In 6 days, God made the world. Yes, sir, no less than 6 days, the world. And you are not bloody well capable of making me a pair of trousers in 3 months." So the tailor responds to him and says, my dear sir, look at the world and look at my trousers." When Beckett brought this wonderful scene into his play called Fin de Partie, I think he was rendering a broken world not necessarily as dark, but awash in what he envisioned in the stage design of his theater productions, what he called grisâtre, this kind of very strange existential gray. And experiencing the horrors of World War II as an exile in Paris, Beckett came to see the world not in black and white terms, but in this limbo of a very strange and subtle gray color. The second person I want to use as a mystic to contextualize how I'm going to read Kubrick is Leonard Cohen. On his 82nd birthday, he released the latest single that rejoins with the refrain, "You want it darker, we kill the flame." How many of you have heard that new single? A few of you. Okay, go and listen to it after this talk. The troubadour of darkness and of the blues, Cohen, only gets darker with age, and his last composition really, I would say, is a confrontation with the deep darkness of death that we all confront. What he says, though, that's interesting, and this will be relevant to looking at Kubrick, is that humanity, in his perspective, humanity is ultimately responsible for the dousing of the flame of hope and redemption, and so the purpose of the artist is to be the one who chooses to abscond with that flame of hope. Cohen sings, "If you are the dealer, I'm out of the game. If you are the healer, it means I'm broken and lame. If thine is the glory, then mine must be the shame. You want it darker, we kill the flame." There's much more to unpack with Leonard Cohen, and I have a forthcoming book on that, which hopefully down the road we'll be able to share together in terms of looking at his own kind of mysticism called Tangle of Matter and Ghost. So this brings me to Kubrick and the way that I'm reading Kubrick and the Kabbalah of Kubrick. First of all, to define, Kabbalah is the word that's used for Jewish mysticism. It means the received tradition or the esoteric tradition. What I want to try to suggest in the few minutes that I have with you here, and then we'll have some time for questions, is that the worlds that are created inside of Kubrick's vast cinematic oeuvre are at once darker than Samuel Beckett's grisâtre, this kind of strange limbo of gray, and actually devoid of even a divine flame that we see flickering in the latest work of Leonard Cohen. Kubrick, I would suggest, takes the bullock's trousers that Beckett opened with as is. That is, that the world is broken, and he doesn't complain. He doesn't complain to the manager, he doesn't complain to the tailor. There seems to be, actually, no one in charge of the shop and no one in charge of the world. So I lay before you Beckett, Cohen, and Kubrick as three exemplars of contemporary mysticism, what the great scholar of Kabbalah, Beth Shalom, once called intuitive Kabbalists. So what does this mean? A Kabbalist is a mystic, and to be an intuitive Kabbalist, one could never claim that any of these artists, whether it's Beckett, Cohen, or Kubrick, who is our subject for discussion, engage in any kind of formal study of Jewish mysticism or Kabbalah. But what I'm arguing is that the worlds inside of his oeuvre, of Kubrick's oeuvre, are so disturbing and so disorienting that I think we can all agree that every viewer must be willing to delve deeper into the never-ending abyss of our own heart of darkness. That is what Kubrick is a genius at doing. And as an auteur, we always feel on a certain level that he's masked behind a work of high or low literature that he adapts. You'll notice that almost every single film that he made, I think almost every one, was an adaptation of a work of literature written by someone else. But there's no mistaking Kubrick's vision as it translates into these very distorted and disorienting worlds of horror, of subtle horror that he creates for the viewer. Now, as confession, having seen almost over the span of a few decades, I think almost every single film that Kubrick made during my own immersion in the world of filmmaking and actually working in film, I often felt like the protagonist, Alex, in A Clockwork Orange, undergoing the Ludovico Technique. Remember the Ludovico Technique? Where the eyes are wide open, and eventually in his last film, the eyes are wide shut, and you have to, in a sense, continually behold and contemplate the gaze of whatever it is that's going on the screen, in this case, in A Clockwork Orange, some very disturbing material. So with my eyes wide open, unable to ever shut and turn away, my desire as a viewer upon these images, which I hope will eventually relent, keep on taking me deeper and deeper into this abyss of darkness. Now, Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, has a name for this realm that I think Kubrick is the master of. That realm is called the Sitra Achra. That is, it's the other side. So Kabbalah, the Jewish mystics, envisioned the world in very dualistic terms. That is, that there is a place of light, there is a place of darkness, there is a place of holiness, and there is a place of distortion. So Kubrick, I'm arguing, is a master artist who is able to represent this world of distortion, which we call the Sitra Achra. Now, for example, I brought one example just to show you, throughout the ages, something that you probably have never seen or thought about is that even though Judaism is supposed to be an aniconic religion, that is, we don't focus on imagery, obviously the CJM is countering that proclivity and opening up the worlds of imagery that are part of Judaism. But in the Jewish mystical tradition, what's fascinating is that images and the contemplative focus on imagery is extremely important. So this is an example from the 16th century. You can see it's kind of a circle with radiating points from the center that kind of spike out. And these are called ilanot. They are trees, or they are ways of modeling that world that I spoke of at the beginning, called the World of Holiness. The World of Holiness is understood and can be mapped out according to 10 spheres of emanation or divine consciousness. And what Kubrick is doing is he is seeing the flip side. If you can imagine seeing the reflection of something like this and seeing it reflected through a looking glass darkly or through a mirror that was broken or distorted, this same mapping of divine consciousness which the mystics feel is embodied within the world, if we open our eyes to be aware of it, is also reflected on the other side. So it's a very strange kind of dualism that exists. And one of the expressions that they use is to explain it, rather than just using this world and that world, is to say it's kekof bifnei Adam. That is, that the other world, the side of distortion, is like an ape before a human being, right? So we all know, whether or not we accept it or not, that on a certain level, we share certain DNA that come from the apes, but we are, as human beings, as Homo sapiens, we are different. What the Kabbalists are saying is that proclivity to return to our animal roots and to our base desires is always embedded in who we are and what we are. And the distance that we like to say that exists between ourselves as animals and beasts and as ourselves as sophisticated thinking beings is a very minuscule, asymptotic difference. And Kubrick is a master of taking us back to that place of desire and the place, I would say, of creaturely appetites. I think what is so fascinating to me about Kubrick's work, and Gravity really challenged me to go back and to think a lot about all the cinema of Kubrick that I've looked at over the years, is that I think Kubrick does share with Kabbalah the eternal question and concern that human beings like us face all the time in our quotidian existence, and that is the problem of evil. Given the tremendous suffering and the calamities that affect every area of human existence, as well as the prolific manifestation of evil, of hatred, and everything in terms of the corruption of the moral and social structure of the life that we live, both the mystic, I would argue, and the cineast, or the auteur, remain troubled and try to find ways of overcoming it by making meaning out of this darkness and distortion. Kabbalah dares to ask the question, how could evil become part of the domain that is ruled by an absolutely perfect and good creator? Kubrick is less interested in that first question, but more so in the corollary, which is, how can evil sustain itself and retain its power in the world? 5? Okay. How can evil sustain itself and retain its power in the world? So for the sake of time, I want to leave that as a kind of open question. I'm going to skip over some of the history of Kabbalah. If you want to learn more about that, I teach that regularly through the Bay Area. You can find out through Lahr House and other places where we can go into it more deeply together. But we could say there is a certain kind of pessimism that is quite prevalent in the way that Kubrick sees the world, and that is not foreign to the Kabbalists. The mystics have either an optimistic or a pessimistic view of the world, and it all comes down to whether or not evil is something that is a byproduct of the creative process, or whether it exists in its own realm. Now, in Judaism, the more that you push these two realms and pull them apart to the point where they become, as it were, separate entities or separate domains, that's considered to be heresy, right? So Judaism struggles, and the mystics push in a very interesting way at this possibility that there is light, there is darkness, there is evil, there is good, but we can't say that they're fully separate. They're completely intertwined. And part of what Kubrick is interested in, I think, is how is it possible that evil continues to exist and to subsist in the world. I want to suggest as well that part of what Kubrick excels at is being able, for example, to really to offer gifts. I know this sounds strange, but I also see the role of the artist and the ritual artist as one who makes offerings, okay? And whether or not we understand them, whether or not we can receive them, is not really the point, right? Kubrick is unique in that regard, because part of what needs to be done, according to the mystics, is that gifts and offerings need to be made to the other side, to the Sitra Achar, to the realm of evil, to the distorted realm. And we can think very recently of certain ritual moments where in Jewish communities this is done, and most Jews, including their rabbis, have no idea why it's done anymore. We live in a world of cultural incommensurability, and we don't understand these strange magical rituals. I'll give you one as an example that's the centerpiece of the Jewish high holiday called Yom Kippur. That is the goat that's dispatched to the place called Azazel and Yom Kippur. Why is that really done? We say it's done as a form of atonement for the sins of the Israelites, but the mystics take that and look at the ritual and say, actually, it's an offering to Azazel, Azazel being the realm of the other side. And evil has an appetite and needs to be fed. And part of what the mystic, and here what I would say the director as well needs to be able to do, is to make these gifts and these offerings as a way of either controlling or somehow subduing the power of the other side and of evil over us and over our lives. But Kubrick's Kabbalah remains entwined in this struggle without any real hope that a ruse or an offering is actually possible. I think you can agree with me that after you leave any film that you've seen of Kubrick's, going all the way back to his early film noir like in the 50s, that it seems like there is no way to be able to overcome the darkness that is overwhelming our experience of existence, as well as all of the protagonists. And he also constructs sites. It's beautiful to see in the exhibit some of the details. For example, the Overlook Hotel and the maze that's there. Okay, once you look at that miniature, the way that it's designed, I don't know about you, but you feel immediately, and you look at what was rejected as well, right, in terms of some of the sketches, you immediately feel that the model that Kubrick chose was the one that leaves you with no exit. There is no way out of that labyrinth, and it's absolutely terrifying. You're completely enclosed. And if you look at his films, just for an example, think about all the places and spaces where you cannot exit as a protagonist and a viewer from the spaces that he constructs, whether it's in the Overlook Hotel, as we spoke about, whether it's the War Room in Dr. Strangelove, whether it's the sniper's burned out buildings or the barracks in Full Metal Jacket, whether it's and this to me is the pièce de résistance, the hidden castle of midnight orgies and Eyes Wide Shut, you cannot escape, you cannot get away. The sense of the other side is so present, and it completely overwhelms the viewer. And I think he liked to play with that possibility. It's not just the protagonist that's trapped, but we are also trapped in that world. I'll close with one story, then we'll open it up for discussion together. Okay, so this is a wonderful story in the Zohar that I think will leave us with some more open questions. And it's the notion of stewardship. That is, what do we do as human beings and as artists? I would argue that all of us on some level are artists in terms of the way that we navigate through the world and try to create meaning. So how do we navigate and do this work? The Zohar, the classic text of Jewish mysticism from the 13th century in Castile, Spain, has a wonderful parable that I'll leave you with. A king had a valuable treasure with a serpent curled around it in order to protect it. Whomever tried to stretch out his or her hand towards the chest was attacked by the serpent and slain. The king, however, had a special friend. And the king said to the friend, whenever you wish to enter to use the chest, you have to do so and such to the serpent, and then you may open the chest and use my hidden treasure. In the same way, the Zohar says, the Blessed Holy One has curled the serpent around the realm of holiness. I'm not going to explain the whole parable. Part of it is just to dwell in the mystery, like in a film of Kubrick's. But what I've been trying to suggest very briefly here is that my own subjective personal experience, both as a ritual artist as well as a filmmaker, has been imbued with the imagination of the intuitive Kabbalists. And I think that Kubrick really brings that to the forefront and makes it extremely accessible in a very non-technical way, but it's incredibly sophisticated. When you look at the amount of research that he does for every single film, it's absolutely mind-boggling to see how much work he does behind the scenes in order to be able to become, in a sense, a master who is able to create a kind of distorted and alternate reality of the reality that we think is the subject of the film. And he does that through luscious, surreal cinematography, and that, in many ways, I think is the offering that he offers us as viewers, that we feel like we can, in some ways, access that valuable treasure with the serpent curled around it. And ultimately, in every single one, I would say almost every single one of Kubrick's films, I don't think that there is a sense of hope, that any of the characters, or the protagonist at least, is able to touch that treasure without being bitten by the serpent. And so I would suggest that I think on a certain level, despite Kubrick's brilliance, and he's probably one of the most brilliant auteurs of the 20th century, I would say that his films and his oeuvre are highly tragic because there is no hope of redemption. There doesn't seem to me, and there doesn't feel to me, like there is a way out of this heart of darkness and the evil. But, and this is the part that's interesting, the process of perennially inserting ourselves into these situations and contemplating the gaze and the views that he sets up for us continues to fascinate every single one of us all the way through with our eyes wide shut. Thank you.
What about 2001?
I didn't talk about 2001, and that's because one of the renowned Kubrick scholars who was here, the fellow from England, was Nathan Abrams. Is that right?
Yeah, he pretty much stole your talk.
Uh-huh. Well, he has a great article on 2001: A Space Odyssey, and he has his own reading of Kabbalah in 2001: A Space Odyssey. I didn't go in that direction because he's already done the work that needs to be done there, so I wanted to leave that to him. I was trying to explore a different side, but I think, and again, I didn't really have time to share with you all the remarks I'd prepared. The dialogue that takes place midway through the film, or somewhere near the end, between Hal and I'm blanking on the name of the protagonist who is human. Dave. Between Hal and Dave, and the kind of evil or monstrosity that begins to overcome and to kind of structure this alternate universe is incredibly disturbing. And of course, Kubrick was very interested in artificial intelligence. We see some of the stills from AI, which he didn't end up doing, but Spielberg did. But in Space Odyssey 2001 Space Odyssey, it's clear that he is interested in these realms of light and of darkness, of good and evil. And I don't know, you tell me, at the end of the film, is there any sense of hope or the possibility of redemption that emerges? Yeah? Well, where's the redemption?
It's hard to encapsulate things like this, but yeah, if you take the titles of 2001, so say The Dawn of Man, Jupiter, Jupiter mission 18 months later, you add up a simple English gematria, you end ended up with 777. I don't know if you're familiar, this is more of a European Kabbalistic thing. It's actually prophesized in the Zohar.
Yeah.
So you could say it's at least as early as the 12th century, right? So if you add up the pathways of a lightning flash that extends down the tree, it equals 777. And then in the Bach here, Gevora 216, 6 times 6 times 6 is described as a big red eye. And I find that just fascinating. But the whole thing is, I think I resonate with Rob Agger's idea that the monolith is the screen itself turned.
Yeah.
And so there's all these clues to change your perspective on the thing. And so you're like in the thing itself. And so yeah, there's a transcendence that's being pointed at, but you're not given it on this level. It's another dimension. And so it points at the other dimension. That's why it's Jupiter beyond the infinite. It's Chesed and Gevora. So you say Chesed is Jupiter in the current correspondences that relate to the tree, which are applicable. I mean, there's these things that exist that if you use the Ari's old system don't work the same way. And so he's kind of reconciling. It's aimed at the nullification of the Qlippot. So it's not just like a celebration of the Qlippot, like you're saying. I wouldn't take it that way.
So let me just define one of the things. There's a lot of technical terms. What's your name? So David was sharing a very interesting interpretation with a lot of technical terms. I want to just pull one of them out, which I didn't have time to talk about, which is the Klippa, the realm of the Qlippot. That is, the realm of the husks is the realm of this other domain, the side of evil. And what David is suggesting, which I think is interesting, I have to think about it some more, is that 2001, which I didn't talk about, points to the possibility of transcendence and that idea of the monolith as the screen. Some others have spoken about that as well. I think it's possible, and I think it's the closest that he gets, perhaps, to suggesting that a transcendent moment is possible in the act of viewing and of making film. And it's really up to, part of what he's maybe suggesting in that film is that it's up to the viewer as well as to the director to be able to shift that perspective, to move towards that possibility of seeing light and redemption in a very darkened world. And I think that's why, again, I bracketed 2001 specifically because I didn't want to go there. But I think it's possible that he's at least pointing towards it. The rest of his oeuvre, though, I would argue still, really, I didn't say it was a celebration of evil, but it's a deep reflection and contemplation on the problem of evil within the world, and how do we navigate the world where there is no God or there is no creator that's in control, right? Where the world has kind of gone askew, and we leave everything up to the human mind and to the human heart. And that's a horrifying kind of place to be, and he takes us deeply into that space, and I think in some of the most provocative and poignant ways.
One more question.
Okay.
Killer Talk, loved it. Very inspired by a lot of the stuff you're saying about creaturely appetites and this thing of feeling trapped in his films and whether we want to escape. I wonder if Kubrick, he walks this line of like accepting the duality, which is kind of allowing both to exist at the same time when we want to, and yet also we don't want to. And that there is this kind of third state of being, which might be horror or terror mixed with some type of actual acceptance and satisfaction.
It's an interesting way of looking at it. Perhaps, I mean, he's on a certain level, he does resign himself to the reality that there is no stopping or snuffing out of evil. That's why I made this suggestion that part of his artistry is to work as an offering, right? In the same way that the goat to Azazel is an offering to the other side. I think a lot of his films are offerings, and they're forms of a ruse to try to somehow to control it or to swerve it or to navigate it. I think given how prolific Kubrick was and unrelenting in his search for that possibility of pointing to something beyond, that he was never satisfied enough to be able to accept it as being the ultimate reality. So he does seem to be pointing to something else. It comes up in 2001, but I think you can also see it as well in a kind of surreal and ironic way, very darkly in Eyes Wide Shut, right? This is supposed to be conventionally the way that he adapted the screenplay. Is conventionally it's a story of a marriage, and ultimately about what happens within a very normal kind of mundane existence and the world of fantasy that exists, and how, in this case, the dream world and the world of reality are constantly intertwined. And again, when we get to the end of that film, you ask the question, is there the possibility of redemption, or is there the possibility of pointing to something else that exists beyond, where these two competing realms can actually either be reconciled or they can be transcended? I think part of his artistry is that he leaves it as an open question. We're stuck as viewers inside, in the midst of the struggle. And that's part of what, in my humble opinion, makes his work so sacred as an artist, is that he's allowing us to engage in that struggle, but he's not prescribing the way out or what the resolution is. Thank you. Thanks.
Everyone, thank you very much for coming. I didn't mention this at the beginning, but this is important to take note. We record all of the gallery chats here, and you can listen to them on SoundCloud. So go to soundcloud.com/Jewseum, and you'll find all of the Kubrick gallery chats, including the quite wonderful one that Nathan Abrams gave, in which I know I actually recognize several of you that were also at that talk. And then we will now be taking a break from our gallery chats for a month, and we will resume with the exhibition From Generation to Generation on December 1st, where we have an artist come in and talk about her work. So I hope to see some of you back then. But thank you very much for coming. And please feel free to stick around to talk to the rabbi or amongst yourselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry.